There we go. Can you all see that? You should see a field of very pretty flowers. Just to tell you a little bit about how I came to ecumenism, really. I was raised in an interchurch family. My dad was a high church Anglican, my mum a conservative free church evangelical. And so I spent an awful lot of time going to two churches as a child, and so grew up in that space. So even though I never considered myself an ecumenist, my parents never were involved with churches together movements in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. When I discovered it myself as an adult, it just felt like I was at home, really. And so it's something that is close to my heart as well as a deep interest of mine. So why the picture of the wild flowers on the first slide? Not just because it looks pretty, but to me, this is a mental image when I think of the churches in the UK, in England particularly, because those are the ones I know the best. And so it's a field of wild flowers blowing in the breeze. And the breeze is the Holy Spirit working within them. And it's a joyful sight, at least it is to me. The flowers are all different, they're all beautiful. They're all together, and sometimes they're quite uncontrollable. And then you'll see in the midst of the picture, there's also a butterfly. And when I look at that, I sometimes think, does that butterfly think it's better than the rest of the flowers? And so there's kind of, I could talk about that for a little while, but don't worry, I won't. I'll stick to my subject, which is receptive ecumenism. So what is receptive ecumenism? It's a model of receptive ecumenism that's been developing over the last 10 to 15 years and is now central to much of the ecumenical work at a national and an international level. It's used in many of the traditional bilateral, so above the radar talks that go on, such as the English and Welsh Anglican Roman Catholic Committee, and also ARCIC, so the Anglican Roman Catholic International Committee. And in the UK, there's been a lot of encouragement to engage with it from the ecumenical instruments and specifically Churches Together in England. At the heart of receptive ecumenism is humility. It's a humility that each tradition has something to learn from the other. It's not about movement to another tradition, but movement to a broader understanding and appreciation of the other. And you'll hear me use that phrase, the other, a lot in this presentation. And when I say the other, I mean a tradition that is not the one that you consider your own. So it's looking for what we can learn from that other tradition. And the language that's used is often one of gift. It's used so often because each tradition can offer gifts to the other. And obviously for someone to offer a gift, it has to be received as well. So that talks about the two sides of receptive ecumenism, the giver of the gift and the person being open and willing to receive the gift as well. So this is not an ecumenical model of letting go of one's own tradition. Bishop Hendrick states it's about embracing more through a deeper understanding of each other. And in fact, many people who practice receptive ecumenism discover a deeper appreciation of their own tradition through helping others understand it better. That's often been the case with interchurch families, I know. They receive the gift of perhaps a different practice or understanding of God through hearing what the other has to say, or watching the other at worship. And receptive ecumenism also acknowledges the shame of disunity and its significant contribution to the broken witness of the churches. But it seeks to be hopeful, sharing together, and in so moving together on a journey towards greater unity and a deeper and more significant witness to the world. What's interesting as well is that not all churches have the same vision of unity. And from working with churches across the nation, I do think that not every church has the same idea of full visible unity. For some it is shared mission, for some it is shared worship, and for some it still is full visible unity. But as we practice receptive ecumenism, as we learn from each other and as we walk together, I think there is that continued journey towards unity in all its forms. And so the activity of receptive ecumenism, I believe, is part of mission, and it can be in our homes and in our localities, as well as at this national and international level. So how did it emerge? It comes from the work of Professor Paul Murray, who is a Catholic theologian based at Durham University, and he's written widely on receptive ecumenism over the last 15 years. Some of his work is pretty unpenetrable, but much of it really is quite readable and very helpful. I've put one particularly good reference at the end of this presentation. So, you know, if this whets your appetite, there's a few suggestions throughout the presentation of things you might want to look at. And Murray says, what do we need to learn, and what can we learn or receive with integrity from our others? And for me, there's several key words in that quote. The word need. Do we really believe we need to learn anything else from the other traditions? Are we quite comfortable in our own tradition? Are we open? There has to be a need to learn, a desire to learn. And then we're talking about both learning and receiving. And these are all things, again, you need an attitude that is willing to receive and an attitude that is open to learn. So it requires setting aside our own views that we know everything, that we get everything right, and being open to receive from the other. And also integrity. Obviously, integrity is hugely important in all aspects of faith life. But when we're working with others, when we're seeking to walk together, there needs to be integrity, there needs to be honesty, as well as humility, as I've already mentioned. So other writers will include Gabrielle Thomas, who is English Anglican, and she's focused on women in the church, and she's done some research about receptive ecumenism there. Sarah Gellin, who's Swedish, she's come at it from a feminist perspective. Antonia Paizi's Australian, and she looks at it, she's written a book. Antonia Paizi's book is really looking at things from an ecclesial section. I would say there's a couple of good chapters in that, which if you haven't got the time for a whole book, there's a couple of good chapters that kind of summarise it. The last chapter particularly is very good. Helen Slipper, who's the National Ecumenical Officer for the Church of England, produced a very helpful little book, which is from Grove Books, which costs only £4, called Enriched by the Other. So that's just a very good first sort of introduction to receptive ecumenism. And then Gregory Ryan, who works alongside Paul Murray at Durham. So those are some other writers you may wish to consider. So the other thing to say is that the roots of receptive ecumenism can be found in the writings of St. John Paul II. And he was one of the first people to talk about receptive dialogue as an exchange of gifts. It's also taken into account observation of lived experiences in ecumenical relationships over the years. These include those in interchurch marriages, and then some significant sort of national and international relationships, such as the bishops Derek Warlock and David Shepherd in Liverpool in the 1980s, and also the relationships between a number of popes and archbishops of Canterbury over the years, again symbolising by the giving and receiving of gifts. I would say that receptive ecumenism has been embraced very much so by the Anglican and the Roman Catholic churches, particularly their ecumenists. But it has a lot more to offer the church more widely, and it is filtering through into other spaces. It does, of course, also happen naturally wherever relationships develop between people of different Christian traditions. For example, when working together on action or mission projects. And often people from different churches come together in these projects, not with the intention of serving Christian unity, but with a different goal. But in the process, these relationships are formed. And that's where your receptive ecumenism can happen almost naturally, just by conversations. As people get to know each other, they become less other and more known, more understood, and with an open heart and an open mind, we can learn and be challenged by their witness, their worship, and also their understanding of God. So what is receptive ecumenism for, and why does it matter? You'll see on this slide, I've started with John 17, verse 21. That they may all be one, as you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. For me, the verse from John's Gospel says a lot. In fact, in terms of ecumenism, it says it all. It was the prayer of Jesus on the night before he was betrayed. And these words have real significance for the church and for our understanding of God and of each other. As God in the Trinity is one, so here Jesus prays that we will also be united with God and with each other. And so receptive ecumenism matters because Jesus prayed, may they all be one. And this is one way in which we can move towards this goal, this being receptive ecumenism. Not only on a spiritual level, but on a practical and strategic level as well. Because in order to journey towards unity, we do need to understand each other better. We can't walk alongside people that we don't understand because we can't get into step with them. And it's important for mission. People see God through the actions of the church. And when we fight amongst ourselves, when there is division and hurt, people do not see a loving God, but a self-seeking and arguing church, arguing people. How often do we hear people say they don't engage with church or indeed with God because of issues linked to disunity? And examples of receptive ecumenism in action have much to teach the church. Here I'm going to point to the lived experience of those in interchurch marriages. My own personal and professional experience has shown me how much we can learn from those in this. How much we can learn from the other in a domestic situation. When the door is shut and sometimes the curtains closed, we're all much more real with each other. And that for me is a challenge to receptive ecumenism as well. Receptive ecumenism can sometimes be very polite. It's everybody, representing their churches at national meetings. And there's something very real about the receptive ecumenism that we see in interchurch families, because people are themselves with their family. There's no guard put up, because we can't keep that up, can we, with those that we are closest to, those that we live with on a daily basis. And mixing family and faith always lead to deep and strong emotions. And so the love that is shared through interchurch couples is rooted in faith, in equity, and in the humility that it takes to learn from their partner. Really, receptive ecumenism is in the very DNA of being an interchurch family. Through this loving relationship, both traditions benefit, not just through faithful service of both partners, but through a deepening and broadening of their spiritual engagement with God, which then feeds into their churches and beyond. For example, interchurch couples are often engaged with ecumenical activity outside of their own church communities. And finally, it matters because receptive ecumenism can lead to something new, something positive, and something hopeful, but also to something that might be unexpected. The Holy Spirit is alive and working through people and through receptive ecumenism, through those who humbly practice it. There is an openness to be changed and not an already decided agenda. There is room for the Spirit to do something new. There there are not spaces where people shouldn't have conversations in receptive ecumenism, because if we're being very real with each other and being very open, then there's not very much that we can't talk about if we do it with care and compassion. And so there is room for the Spirit to do something new and unexpected as we journey together to being mutually changed. So how can we begin to be receptive ecumenists? Firstly, we need to speak to each other. And I know that sounds really basic, but it's actually true. We often live and worship in our own bubbles, and we need to step out of our bubbles and talk to people who are other, who are different to us. We have to listen to each other, really listen with an open heart to what you might want to receive, to what God might be telling you through someone else after you've listened. Ask God, what are you teaching me through this conversation? Where can I experience more of you in my life? And we can only do that if we do really listen to one another. We also need to acknowledge our own prejudice and hurt, and also pay attention to issues of power in our relationships. We all bring baggage, but in order to have integrity, we need to acknowledge where we are making assumptions about the other person or their traditions. As we acknowledge our brokenness, it allows new ways of healing to emerge that we had not considered before. For example, I remember many years ago now, I went to see a nun for spiritual direction. And it was a time when I was in a particular sort of space in terms of my own church. It was quite a narrow space, I guess. And she suggested that I get out of church meetings and services and just go for a walk and spend time with God outdoors. And at the time, I hadn't actually even considered that, because that wasn't part of my church experience. And these days, that's much more common, but I'm actually going back over 25 years. And I remember it totally transformed my experience. It was just what I needed. As somebody who talks a lot, as you've probably gathered already, it was really good for me to be in that different space. And that expanded my own spiritual journey in a small way. I'd also say be brave and don't be afraid to ask questions. As long as they're asked kindly and received humbly, I think it's really important to be brave and ask questions that you really want to know the answer to. Often we're very good at being polite, aren't we? And we don't want to ask those questions. But I think there's something about receptive ecumenism, which is about those deep relationships formed over time. Now, often we do have to give time to these relationships to be developing. But we need to be brave and to go past the superficial to really learn from each other and really receive from each other. And then we want to be honest. As much as we love our own traditions and church communities, no church or tradition is perfect. Acknowledge that to yourself. Reflect on where it is that you need to learn, and so be open to hear and receive the gifts that God wants to teach each of us through each other. And finally, I would say to pray for all of God's people. Ask for God's love for all to grow in you, and to ask God to open your mind and heart for the Spirit to show you what you can learn from each other. So I've already mentioned a couple of these resources. Enriched by the Other, which was the Small Grove book by Callan Slipper. The Gabrielle Thomas book as well is it's a thicker read. It's about 200 pages, I think, but it's very readable and it tells you an awful lot. It's got the first chapter contains a brilliant explanation as to how receptive ecumenism emerged, and then it looks at the experiences of women in the church from across the churches and the things that they've had in common, drawing out central themes. It's a very good book, so I would recommend that one for somebody who wants an interesting but not too dense read in terms of language. And then there is the course on the Churches Together in England website called Embracing the Other, which can be done as a single session or over a series of evenings. So I've talked for a little bit. I'd like to give you a chance to talk now. So I've got a slide here. And this is just a very simple exercise to get people talking about how they view their churches. I just would suggest we had perhaps 5-6 minutes on this in small groups, and to choose one of these images. I've presented you with 3 because images say different things to different people. So choose one of these images and reflect on your churches using this particular image. So you've got a building, a garden, and a body. And just practice listening to each other and hearing what each other has got to say, and just reflect together on your churches using this image for a few minutes.